Okay, I think we're recording. Yeah, it looks like it. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Carrie Ann Sutu. I am an occupational therapist at Gowan Consulting, and I have my coworker with me here. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Antonella Finateri, and I'm with Gowan Consulting, occupational therapist.
So Antonella has some experience in regards to conducting virtual and tele-treatment sessions with clients. So today I'll be asking her some questions about conducting virtual assessments. So I'm aware, as many OTs are, that we need to follow guidelines as set out by our professional bodies. So I'm just wondering if, Antonella, you can tell me what are the highlights from our CODO guidelines for telepractice in OT?
Sure. The four most important guidelines for telepractice that are set out by our provincial college are, the number one is jurisdiction. OT should always know and apply the legislation, the standards, and guidelines for telepractice services within the client's jurisdiction of where they live. So this is important if the client lives outside of Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
The second most important guideline is risk management. OT should consider what services can be reasonably and safely delivered using telepractice technologies. We need to consider the client's abilities. We should also have a process in place to deal with any adverse or unexpected events that would occur during a telepractice session. The third most important guideline is that OTs must always ensure that the technology that they're using is of sufficient quality to communicate effectively. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth one, most important guideline that our college tells us is about confidentiality. OTs using telepractice services must take reasonable measures to maintain confidentiality and to protect personal health information.
So those are, as you said, those are just the highlights, right? There's a whole lot more guidelines to, okay. So
yeah, I think there's about 7 or 8 altogether. Don't quote me on that, but those are just, out of all of them, those are the most important I found to be that really reflect on telepractice.
Okay. It's interesting. I didn't even know that we had that guideline until you pointed it out. So it's good to even just know that it exists and that it's there for our reference.
Yes, absolutely.
So we've talked a little bit about technology. We know technology evolves very quickly. So I just wondered if you could speak to the literature review that you've done regarding virtual assessments. So what apps were highlighted in the research, and are those apps effective for us as OTs?
Yes, definitely. So there are a lot of research studies that have looked at various software programs to support OT in-home assessments. There are 3 of all of them. I'm just going to talk about 3 of the highlighted apps and their effectiveness. Number 1 is called Sweet Home 3D. And this is a free computer program that's created for interior design. The user can create floor plans and rearrange furniture. So this is helpful, like if you're doing a virtual ergo and you want to design the workstation, you can actually do that using, it's got this graph where you can design the actual desk and the workstation and where the chair is and the phone and monitors, etc. So therapists found using this very positive, but also they recommended some changes to the software that would be better to meet the needs of their clients. So it wasn't applicable to all clients. There were some shortfalls with using it. The second app, it's called Housing Enabler. And this is a mobile app that's designed to replace a paper-based assessment form. And the therapist found this more advantageous than the paper-based one. It was easier to navigate and easy to export data into an email or a file. And then the final one that the research talks about is called OT Draw. And this was identified by the authors of this various study as a program that many OTs are already using. a lot of the OTs, the research study was mainly conducted in Australia, so a lot of these OTs are abroad using this particular software program. So OT Draw, it's not a free software, so it is a purchase of an annual subscription, right? So those were the applications, and then there's the research also talked a lot about other telepractice methods, and there's two main ones that they talked about. The first one was the use of digital photos and video conferencing together. And the studies reported high levels of acceptability, ease of use, satisfaction, and reduced resources in terms of time and costs. The main challenge in one study found that it was that over half of family members, which was about 57%, did not have the confidence to take and email pictures. So the studies have involved technicians or therapists delivering and training users how to use the equipment, which offsets the potential time and cost savings.
Okay.
Right. And then the other one was telehealth, just telephonic sessions. The research indicates that most OTs are receptive to telehealth than any other form of technology. This approach has been demonstrated to be more feasible and effective.
Well, and I think depending on the population we're working with, everyone knows how to use a phone, but not everyone knows how to use computers and internet and those sorts of things. So I think that's probably why telephonic is more popular and trusted, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was just wondering, have you investigated any of these apps yourself or seen them in action?
I have, like I actually looked at the 3D Draw. Now that's the free one. So the other two, Housing Enabler and OT Draw, are paid. So I did try the Sweet Home 3D, and I provided a YouTube link in the written the written material that I provided to Gowan. So there is a YouTube link, and it's a tutorial that shows you how to use 3D Draw, and it was quite easy to use. I just basically did an ergo of my own workstation using it. It's quite easy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So are you actually looking at the the client's setup through that app, or is it all just done through design?
So it would be, it's sorry, what do you mean by looking at
So is there a way for you to actually see through that technology? Are you using like a webcam or something to see what the end user's environment looks like currently?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I see what you're saying. No, I'm not 100%, and I would have to use it more. I just sort of tested it for a little bit, but I think you're basing it on pictures that the client's taken of their workstation, right?
Okay, gotcha.
You're, basically, and then you're also asking for them to take measurements and what have you. So based on the information they're providing you through pictures and measurements taken, then you do the workstation. So again, this lends itself well to virtual, right? So you can't see, you're accessing the client remotely.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned a study in your cheat sheet, and it's called Information and Communication Technology Use Within Occupational Therapy Home Assessments. So I'm just wondering, what are the key findings in the article, and what can you kind of summarize for us?
Okay. So that's the name of the article. It was published in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy in 2019. It's a really neat literature search that was done by a group of OTs in Australia, and it stems from, they looked at studies that were conducted from 2000 to 2017 in various parts of Europe, like mainly Europe, and there was also US was in there. Unfortunately, Canada wasn't part of their lit search, but that's okay. US is close enough. So the key findings were that the readily available technology, such as digital cameras and video conferencing, can be used to aid in the assessment and improve efficiency of OT service delivery. But some users may require delivery of equipment and training the end user on how to do them. Remember, we talked about that study where over half of the patient and family members didn't know how to take a picture and email it.
Yeah.
So they may require some training and actually even delivering of the equipment. So that was one. Another key finding from the SLIT search that was done is that software programs, such as the ones we just talked about, the 3D Home, OT Draw, Home Enabler, they're all, they're developed to date, but they require further modifications before they can be adapted more widely. So there were some limitations with the various programs that the OTs were using.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third key finding, which I think is most important, is that the research indicates that technology-based occupational therapy assessment methods are effective in cost savings. So there's an agreement, a high agreement between the traditional method, like the in-home that you meet with the person in person, do your in-home, and there's a high agreement between that and the technology-based assessments.
Mm-hmm.
It was high, like, so anywhere from 78 to 98% agreement between those two methods. Now it has to be, one thing that's important is that the traditional in-home was found to be more sensitive to detecting hazards in the home. Like, so if you're doing an in-home safety assessment, it was a little bit more sensitive to that.
Sure.
But overall, research indicates that technology-based OT assessments are effective in their cost savings.
Okay. So what would you say are some of the challenges then when it comes to completing virtual assessments? And I think maybe I'll ask this in a different way, because I think I have a few questions that are specific to the challenges. So maybe I'll ask those questions specifically. So in terms of cost effectiveness and reliability, because that can be a challenge, what video conferencing software should we be using at Gowan with our clients?
Okay, so we've done, I've spoken to Joseph on, the IT specialist at Gowan, and so he provided me his feedback. So I think overall it's important to note that the software or the application the OT chooses or you choose to use will depend on your client's capabilities, like how they're able to use that within their home or in their workplace. Some workplaces like BMO will only, or Scotiabank, some of the banks will only allow you to use their software, so they have to set it up for you.
Mm-hmm.
And some are a bit more flexible. If you're seeing the client in the home, you have to look at their data, like do they have a good Wi-Fi connection or do they have good data? So all those things you need to sort of consider. But overall, the programs like 8x8, Teams, Zoom, FaceTime, and the Duo apps, they're all recommended products.
Okay.
All of these products offer similar capabilities in that they allow you to remotely interact with your client. Some will be more flexible than the others, but your client's ability to access the product is the most determining factor.
Okay.
Okay.
So when we're looking at, is there a trade-off potentially between accessibility and security? I guess I'm just thinking, I've always wondered what, should we be doing online sessions with someone, let's say via FaceTime? Do we know how secure it is? Do we know that that's a good way to maintain confidentiality? I don't know if you know the answer to that question, but I'm just kind of thinking out loud.
I think it's important to be able to discuss that as part of the consent process with your client, to let them know that, when you're looking at the written consent and the verbal consent, to be able to discuss that when you are doing these sort of video conferences, there may be a risk, right?
Okay. Yeah.
That you that it won't be completely secure or private. Ways of minimizing that risk is just ensuring that you're on private like you're not on a public Wi-Fi, you're in a secured internet area, and you're in a private space so that there's no one around, there's no distraction, no one walking by. And so there's things you can do to minimize that risk, but there are risks, and those are things that you need to discuss with your client prior to starting.
Yeah.
And just to go back to the software, when you asked about the reliability and cost effectiveness, if you have a client who has a computer and a webcam, Zoom, like the software Zoom, lends itself well for, you get 40 minutes for free. It's a really great tool. And you can also use 8x8 or Teams. But you then have those clients that don't have webcams, so they just have phones. They have a smart. And if they do, then if it's like an iPhone to iPhone, you can use FaceTime. If it's something different, you can use Google Duo, which is DUO, and that works really well for iOS and Android phones. And I was using the Google Duo app with just family and friends this weekend, and it was crazy fun and a really great way to connect, especially given the environment that we're going through. So you get up to 8 people in one. So it's lends itself well for teams, but also individually, the picture is quite clear. So.
Okay. Can that also be used on an iPhone?
Yes. So iPhone and Android phone. So that's the nice part about it, because I was calling family members that don't. I have an iPhone, but they don't, and it, really good reception and
perfect
resolution. Like the image came out clear.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I always have that question because I know you can only FaceTime with someone who is also an iPhone user, but I didn't know if the Google apps or Android apps kind of worked the same way or if they were interchangeable.
Well, that's why it's called Duo, probably, I think, because it's good for both iOS and Android. And that was recommended by Joseph, the specialist. So yeah, it works really well.
Okay, great. So we'll move on. This is kind of a funny question because you had asked me about what I thought about this, so we can maybe just have a conversation about the next piece. But how do we administer cognitive testing virtually or telephonically when usually those are pen and paper type tasks?
Yeah, that's another challenge when you're doing virtual assessments, is how do you administer cognitive tests? Like most of us use Brain Effects. Here at Gowan, a lot of us use that. And that's more of an in-person tablet-based assessment. So I asked you this question and I got some really great information. And if there's basically what we need to do is look at tests that can be either emailed to the client for completing, or they can be accessed online by the client. And then you gave me some really good examples that we're currently at Gowan looking at. And the first one it's called Cambridge Brain Services. And that's completely online platform. OTs can custom create the test. And if there's anything I'm missing, feel free to in here. An invite link is sent out and the clients complete it, send it back. Basically this tests memory, reasoning, concentration, verbal ability, and it is a monthly subscription fee depending on the number of active clients using it. Was there anything I missed that you did?
No, I think really it's just looking at what's the feasibility for our clients. Again, like you said, right? Some of our clients don't have reliable internet and some don't know how to use that kind of technology. So that will only work for a specific population. But I think most of the people that we work with at Gowan are employees and they're probably using technology to some degree. So I think it could be an option for sure.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. And then the next one is called the Brief Cognitive Assessment Tool. And this one tests mainly memory and executive functioning. It's a virtual test option. There is a virtual test option. And the person signs up, gets tested with an online administrator. And then the results are emailed back to the OT or the client.
Mhm. Yeah, so that one I don't know a whole lot about when I was doing my own research. So I don't know if you had looked into it at all, but it's nothing that we would necessarily be administering as an OT, similar to the CBS one that you had just mentioned.
Mhm.
It's more like we would facilitate them getting signed up, and then they would complete the task online and then get some sort of a report after. So again, we're not too sure what that would look like and how beneficial that may be, but it is for sure an option.
That's great. Well, and then yeah, the third one, it's called the Brief A, and this one tests executive functioning. And it's based on behavior. So it's a self-report 75 item questionnaire that's pen and paper.
Mhm.
This one can be emailed to the client. Maybe we could set this up through Penelope. And then, and also you can send one to the client as well to any family member if you're trying to do some collateral information gathering as well. So that seems
Yeah.
to be something that might be more realistic for us to start using.
Yeah. Yeah. So the downfall for that one, Nancy and I were just talking about that one last week. And it's the unfortunate part about it is that we're not actually testing their executive functioning. We're having them complete a self-report of behaviors that are then translated into executive functioning. So I myself have used this standardized testing tool a lot in my previous work, and I loved it because it actually does a really good job at translating those behaviors into the executive functioning, and it's a very wholesome report that you get at the end of it. However, you're not physically assessing the client's executive functioning. So there's, it's accessible, it's easy to administer, it's easy to score, it gives you a good readout, but you're also not physically doing the testing to see what those areas are. So that's a bit of a drawback with that one.
Yeah, and I think we spoke about, I was talking to some other OTs at Gowan, that what we may need to do is, if we're doing a virtual assessment, whether it's an accommodation assessment or a reactivation assessment, we may need to just screen,
Mm-hmm.
like use some of these tests as a screen, and then when we're able to meet with them in person, then we just postpone that part of the objective standardized test, right, to
Yeah.
time when we're able to meet with them in person and complete it. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
mhm.
Yeah. I think Gowan has some good options in terms of doing some of the other testing that's not cognitive, right? We have a lot of other tools that we can administer through Penelope that will help us with getting information for other things.
Mhm.
So things like the roses or the HUDAS, we can get that information back, but cognitive is a little bit more tricky.
Right.
Yeah. So another one of the challenges that you and I had talked about was signed consent. So what do we do there when we're trying to get a signed consent from our client if we're meeting them virtually?
Well, that one's actually quite easy. I thought that would be a really big challenge, but I guess now with Penelope, it's all set up. And so Melanie McLeod is the go-to here for this, but her and I tested it and it worked out really well. So I don't think anyone's ever used it because it's fairly new. So basically in Penelope, you're going to the occupational therapy service file,
Mm-hmm.
then you go to workflow, and then you go to the client task portion, and then you click on add. And then what you do is it brings you to the screen where your client's name, you have to select that. So you do that, and then there's a date that you put in, and it's important to know for here, when you're choosing the date, the due date, you want to change that to the day of the assessment that you're going to be seeing the client, because if you don't change it, the email goes out to the client and it's telling them they have to have it done by the day that you're sending it. So it's not really giving them
Oh, okay.
time. So so you just change it to the day of the assessment. And then under the subject heading, you just put consent form, just write that down, like what it's in reference to. And then you can write any message you want for your client to read.
Mm-hmm.
And then under the forms, you have to click on both the virtual consent form and the Gowan consulting consent form. You want both because each has a little bit different in terms of consent, but you want your standard Gowan consent and the virtual one, right?
Okay.
So click on both, and then you just hit save, click on save, and the consent form's emailed out to the client, and it only requires a mouse signature. So
Oh, that's nice.
yeah, so it was really easy to use, and then they're instructed to email it back to you. So it's all set up in Penelope, the actual consent for virtual, like if you're doing a virtual assessment, it's all there.
Okay, that's nice and easy. And I know a lot of our clients wouldn't necessarily have a printer and a scanner and the capacity to get all that stuff back. So that's nice because it saves a couple steps.
Absolutely. And also on that window, you can tick off, you already talked about, like you can send them the roses, or you can send them the virtual ergonomic office survey. So some of those questionnaires are on there as well, for if you're not able to meet with them in person.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. So I know you've got some experience with conducting virtual sessions in general. We've been kind of talking more about assessments, but I'm just wondering if you can give us some tips on what we could be doing to help us as OTs now that we've moved to more virtual and telephonic treatments. So what are some of the benefits that you can see with conducting those types of sessions in general?
Well, I think the biggest benefit, in my opinion, is that it's an efficient way of delivering services. It really cuts down on the travel time. I think our Barry OTs.
Yeah.
The virtual session is time. It's also time limited. So because it's time limited, so let's say you're doing a 40-minute Zoom session, you have to sort of really focus, right? And so you're reminding your client, we really have just 40 minutes, and let's try to get as much as we can covered. So it really allows the OT and the client to really focus on the important areas of discussion. So again, overall, it's just an efficient way of providing services.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I never thought about that. But if you do see the clock kind of ticking and it's going to shut off after 40 minutes, then it's a very, very good tool to use to continually redirect our clients to stay focused on what we're there to talk about, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point.
If you're in someone's workplace, and even though you might have a private room and people coming and going, and I don't know how many times we've been interrupted, where we're sitting in a private room and then someone else has that booked, so you're picking up your stuff and moving to another room. And so there's a lot more interruptions when you're doing in person, or if you're in their home, there's lots of interruptions there as well. So sure. I just find that it lends itself well, like, you both know you have to turn everything off, you have to be in a private space, and it's very efficient use of time.
For sure. Yeah. So what are the elements of a good virtual treatment session?
Well, I think with any treatment session, it's really important that and I think we all do this, we have a prepared agenda of what topics we want to discuss, especially if it's virtual and you only have, so many minutes, right? So reviewing this at the beginning of the virtual session with the client and specifying the amount of time you have together on the call is also it's important to help guide and focus the treatment session. So that, I think, overall, some of the important elements of a good virtual session is being prepared and then just trying to stay focused in the session that you're having with them. And then also another really important, forgot one other thing, is the virtual, the ability to share your screen. That's why the video conferencing lends itself better than telephonic. Because sorry about that. So when you're able to share the screen, you're able to review educational materials, administer tests. If you're doing like the PHQ-9, for example, you can actually have the client be doing that, and then you can just see it right there live and score it. So it lends itself better that way.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to how we would incorporate function into a virtual session? Because that's always one of my fears, is that I don't want to be calling my clients and then they just think I'm calling a chat. I, as an OT, need to stay focused on function, and the clients don't necessarily understand that. So what do you do to keep it function focused?
So I think just like in terms of that, you're right. Like we don't want it to get into some sort of like psychotherapeutic counseling session. We want it to be very activity based. So
Mhm.
just reviewing, you know, I like to each session review what activities have they done, like just really activity based discussions. Like what have you done this week? What were some of the challenges? What were some of the coping strategies you used to deal with those challenges? Um, and if they're having if they're just starting to talk and it's not like you said, function based or activity based, just redirecting them to they're just talking in general. I'm feeling really anxious and stressful. This is a really bad time for me. Just really bringing it back down to, okay, well, what kind of things did you do this week where you felt that way, and how did you get over that? Like what tools did you use to manage that? So that's yeah.
So you had another really cool strategy that I was hoping that you would share, relating to, I think it was specifically relating to driving, something that you had done in terms of connecting with the client before and after, and then having them complete their exposure on their own. Now I know that right now we're encouraging social distancing, so this may not be applicable immediately, but it is a good strategy. So I'd like you to speak to that a little bit if you can.
So I think you're talking about the exposure therapy clients that we're doing exposure therapy with. And I think given the climate with the COVID restrictions, I think this lends itself well for them doing homework that is safe. And
Mhm.
so an example would be, the client that you're referring to is driving into Toronto is a trigger. So something
Mhm.
he avoids taking a specific exit in Toronto off the Gardner. So this, so the whole virtual check-in, so being able to check with him at the beginning. So his homework is to actually drive. So driving is not, he's not around people. He's in a car, he's on his own. He's able to actually drive from Mississauga to Toronto and then come back. So you can do a whole virtual session that way. So you do like a check-in before, see where he's at in terms of SUDS, be able to make sure that he's using the stress management techniques, and then he does the session, and then when he's completed, he calls you and you do it either telephonically or video conferencing, and then do a check-in afterwards. So you're still able to get that exposure in, that way. So
Yeah, I love that idea. I think that's really great.
yeah.
Yeah. So do you have any final tips for those of us who might be newer to conducting virtual or telephonic sessions before we finish up for today?
I think we've covered a few of them, but I'll just kind of reiterate that I think the first and foremost, when you're sort of setting these up, you want to make sure that the client is aware of the potential benefits and risks of video conferencing. So the benefit is we could do this, I don't have to travel to you, it's more time efficient. But then there's also the limitations with potentially confidentiality, right? So
Mhm.
you want to make sure that that they understand the difference between the in-person sessions and that they're willing to accept those risks. Because some people are, if they know that it may not be, like, you can't guarantee that it's going to be, completely secured, even though you're taking precautions. So they need to understand that and
Yeah.
accept risks. The second one is that there's that recording feature, which we're doing now.
Mhm.
And you want to make sure that there's an agreement between yourself and the client that no one's going to record the session. Because I had that
Oh,
to me when we were using Zoom. It's like my patient's like, I can see that. Are you recording me? And I'm like, no. So right at the get-go, you want to make sure they understand that even though it says that you can record the session, that you won't be recording the session without permission from the other person. So each person needs that permission from each other.
okay.
Right. And then I think it's important, like we did today, is just to take 15 minutes before your scheduled session, more importantly, if it's your first one, to explain to the client how to use the video conferencing. So if you've set up your session and it's only 40 minutes, and let's say it's set up for 4 o'clock, maybe check in a little bit earlier, around 1:45.
Mm-hmm.
Telephone, you don't have to do it by Zoom. So just call your patient, make sure they know what they're doing. And you could do that by phone as well, right?
Yeah.
So just using that before. And then that's also the time where you're ensuring that they understand, like you're going through consent and they understand the risks and benefits of everything.
Okay.
So just that 15 minutes before.
Yeah.
And then obviously a lot of clients, even though you've explained it before, they don't understand that they either need that they'll log on to their desktop computer and they're like, I can't see you, I can't hear you. It's because you don't have a webcam. So make sure that they understand they have a webcam that on like
Mm-hmm.
they're using has a webcam, or they're using their smartphone during that session, right? Because smartphones have that audio
Yeah.
video capability.
Yeah.
So another important thing is we talked about the need to be in a quiet, private space, free of distractions. So like today, I just turned off all the phones when we're doing this webinar. Just make sure there's no one walking around, because any distraction is not good. And then making sure that you are on a secured internet connection rather than a public or free Wi-Fi. So you shouldn't be doing sessions in a coffee shop or library or anything like that.
Yeah.
Right. And the other important thing is agreeing to a backup plan. So just making sure you have a phone number, an email, or a text where you can reach that client if you have to restart the session or reschedule it in the event that you're having any technical problems. So
Mm-hmm.
having that backup plan is important.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And also, just if you're starting off the sessions virtually, just ensuring that your client understands that I always say, we'll try this. If it works and it works well for you and me, then we'll continue. And if not, we'll just have to do it a different way. We'll have to go back to doing in-person sessions, or we'll have to postpone our sessions until we can meet in person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to know or to let our clients know that they do have a choice. We're not forcing them into this, because this can be very uncomfortable for many people. And we still have to make sure we have their full informed consent in participating, and let them know what the alternatives are if they're just not comfortable with sitting in front of a camera.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's just some final tips that were brought to my attention, which I think makes sense. So generally it's better if you don't need the video capabilities, because you can just call directly.
Mm-hmm.
However, again, there's limitations there, because then you can't share your screen. You can't really see the person, make those observations of how they're, like the nonverbal sort of cues that you get from seeing them. So that's not always possible. So if you are doing video conferencing, avoiding peak hours. So like if you're scheduling your session on the hour or every half hour, those tend to be pretty busy. So if you're dialing in to that, you might get a busy, especially nowadays, a lot of people are using this. So you might get a dial tone that's busy. So
Okay.
schedule those sessions like 4:15 as opposed to 4 o'clock or 4:30. So sort of
Interesting.
peak hours, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or if you are scheduling it like at 4 o'clock, right on the hour, then you just call in a little bit earlier or a little bit later, so that you're actually getting in, because you don't get that busy dial tone, right? And then the other third important thing to know is that in terms of the apps, if there's an app to connect, use that. The apps tend to be more reliable than some of the software applications, and they don't rely on telephone infrastructure. So an example is the 8x8. There's an app, soft phone, that you can connect to. Microsoft Teams has an app as well, and
Okay.
Zoom has an app. That's the one we're on right now. We're on their app,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, so the apps tend to be more reliable than the telephone infrastructure, the dial-ins.
Okay, so what you mean by that is, if I have the option to set up a Zoom meeting and do it on my computer, I'd be better to do that than to call into that Zoom meeting using the 1-800
Right.
number provided. Okay,
That's
gotcha.
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that is a really great summary. I thank you so much for taking the time to help us talk through this today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
No problem.